All right, welcome back for another Healthy Minds Workshop live stream. If this is your first time joining us, welcome to your first Healthy Minds Workshop live stream. My name is Dr. Angela Eno, embedded psychologist for CAPS at the College of Education and Human Services at Utah State. And today we're going to be talking about grief. And I've titled this presentation, You Can Grieve Your Own Way. And I believe that the reason for that title will become apparent as we move forward. I want to note that in the bottom corner of the screen there, you should see a tiny URL. I've provided a link there for you to be able to download the slides. You may find the information in the slides helpful, but also I've embedded some links and YouTube videos, things like that, that could be some additional useful information besides what I'm going to talk about. A couple of things before we get started. So first off, I want to mention that this workshop is provided as part of a collaboration between a couple of different entities at Utah State University. The first being the office that I work for, which is Counseling and Psychological Services, better known as CAPS. The second is the College of Education and Human Services, and the last is the School of Graduate Studies. So those are the entities responsible for providing this workshop for you today, and also they fund my position as the embedded psychologist for the College of Education and Human Services. I wanted to mention really quickly, if you happen to be a graduate student within the college, another part of my role is to provide individual counseling at no cost to students within the college. So feel free to reach out to me or contact CAPS if you'd like to schedule individual therapy with me. Another quick note, this workshop is not intended to take the place of mental health care. And so if you or somebody that you know is in need of help, please seek out a qualified therapist. And let's get started. So to start off, I wanted to share this poem that I think is just really beautiful about the role of grief in our lives. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your own bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes, to let it go, to let it go. I think this is especially poignant when it comes to the losses that we suffer due to death, which is of course going to be a major focus of what I talk about today because we're talking about grief. But if you heard me mention this workshop in previous Healthy Minds workshops, you might already know that I'm not only going to focus on the grief that comes from death. And just like we have to accept grief that's associated with death and that type of loss, there's also grief that's associated with other kinds of loss that can take a similar form. And I think this poem in some ways can apply to some of those other losses as well. So I'm not going to show this video, but I did want to include it because it can be useful. So it's embedded here in the slides. If you want to download them, you can go back and watch this later on. This video is really quite beautiful. And by the way, the narrator, I don't know who it is, but she has a very soothing, really nice voice and talks about some of the things that kind of go against the grain or at least stand outside of the things that people will frequently tell us about grief. One of those points that she makes is that grief applies to many other things, which I'll talk about a bit more too. I will note, I think some of the things that she mentions applying to grief, I think it would be important to think about these things on a spectrum, so there are losses that can bring up grief, but kind of grief with a lowercase g, if this makes sense. So not the same level of extreme reactions that we may have in grief with a capital G, such as like traumatic loss or huge shifts and transitions and major losses in our lives. That grief is kind of on a spectrum. So that's something I'd caution you just to think about as you're watching that video, just because I know for myself, as somebody who has experienced a fair amount of the grief with the capital G, it felt a little invalidating to see some of the things that are smaller losses that matter, but maybe I wouldn't have called them grief. As I thought about it some more, I thought, some of the reactions that you may have to some of those smaller losses definitely can hold grief. And I definitely think that what I experience as a small loss may not be the same as what somebody else experiences as a small loss. So just a thought in case you have the same kind of reaction to that video that I do. Even if you do have that reaction, I think there's some useful information in this video that you might enjoy. Enough about the video. Moving on. So as I mentioned, there are a lot of situations that can cause grief in addition to the loss of somebody that you love. Of course, we know that the death of a loved one can cause grief. Many of us know that the death of a pet can cause a fair amount of grief as well. Being diagnosed with a terminal illness or having somebody that you love diagnosed with a terminal illness, another situation in which a lot of the things that you experience will line right up with the things that are experienced with grief. Other losses include the loss of your physical health or your mobility, the loss of your cognitive function or mental health, going through a divorce or a breakup, loss of custody of children, separation from your parents or other family members, involuntary displacement, whether that's, homelessness for example, financial reasons, natural disaster, political conflict, immigration, seeking refuge, seeking asylum. Also loss of a big dream, loss of your trust, loss of your faith, loss of your belief in a just world, major transitions, and the loss of social interaction. Sometimes those two go hand in hand. Any of these situations may cause very similar experiences that can come up with what we traditionally think of as grief. Some others: loss of your job, financial security, loss of trust in authority, loss of your freedom, security, or safety. For example, if you've gone through a trauma. And a couple that I haven't seen others reference, but I would definitely include, at least I haven't seen them reference in the context of a presentation on grief, I should say, would be genocide, intergenerational trauma, destruction of your culture and language, and systemic oppression. I believe and have witnessed as a clinician that many of the effects of these can be quite similar to the effect of grieving a death and a major loss. Excuse me. All right. Next, I'm going to get into a little bit more of the specifics of different types of loss that we can experience and what are some of the kind of hallmark features that we'll see showing up in those types of loss. So when it comes to loss due to a widespread disaster, COVID would definitely be one that counts as this. Also, a natural disaster that kind of covers a wide area and affects a lot of people. Here's some of the things that you may see showing up. So the survivors may have had no chance to say goodbye or resolve issues with the deceased. Survivors may face constant reminders of the loss in the media or in their community. Something that really stands out to me, and I don't know if everyone has seen this yet, but there was a recent kind of small town scandal from Alabama that has been, I think it was Alabama, that has been kind of making waves, I know, on YouTube and TikTok at least, and I've seen a few articles about it, which was basically this family that's kind of embroiled in scandal after two of their sons were potentially connected to the deaths of some other young people in their community. And then there were some maybe implications of some wrongdoing on the part of the father. Anyway, all of that is kind of an aside. But I noticed in some of the media, social media coverage, and things people have been sharing about that was one of the young people involved, other than the young men in that family, one of the young people involved who was grieving the death of his girlfriend connected to all of this had shared how difficult his grief was and how much more difficult it was made by having to see all of the coverage that it's getting and all the shares it's getting on social media, because here's this constant reminder of what happened to his girlfriend and the answers and the justice that he doesn't yet have. This is a good example of how that can play out. Moving on, so survivors may be unable to complete customary rituals. I know I suffered a loss at the beginning of the pandemic, and there wasn't, or there was a funeral, but it, the number of people who could attend were limited, understandably so, due to the pandemic. And I myself, although I was able to attend, in terms of being permitted to attend, I wasn't able to attend because I'm immune compromised. And I think many of us have experienced such losses during this time of the pandemic. And certainly this isn't the only time people are prevented from carrying on with their usual rituals. And I will talk a little bit about some of the situations that come up that likewise have people unable to complete some of their usual rituals, and how that can interfere with grief and exacerbate the difficulty with grief. And finally, it's important to note that some communities and marginalized people may experience a greater impact of a disaster, even if it reaches kind of a broader scale. A good example of this, and I'm kind of hammering on COVID a little bit here unintentionally, I guess, but there was a lot of data showing that Black Americans, for example, had much more loss related to COVID than other ethnic groups, and so did Native Americans, and particularly certain reservations. I know the Navajo reservation in particular was hit pretty hard, especially early on. So some of the reactions that you can see that are related to loss due to disaster, they can definitely show up in the other types of grief, and you may see some of that kind of threaded in as I get more into reactions. But a couple of those that are kind of unique to that, I want to just point out right now too. If it's human caused, there may be a lot of anger toward the individuals who have caused or are perceived to have caused that loss. Blame toward those individuals, maybe even displaced blame toward individuals who weren't necessarily responsible, and even self-blame. If there were warnings that could have prevented that loss, and those warnings were ignored by the person who is grieving, there can be even more self-blame and guilt that takes place. If the survivor feels that they should have done more, there can be an extreme loss of shame. When we talk about guilt versus shame, this is something that is really important to distinguish. So guilt is an emotion that we feel that has to do with, I feel badly about a behavior that I did. So of course, that's something that can show up in the feeling that I should have done more. Shame goes kind of another step and says, I feel badly about who I am as a person because of what has happened. Okay, and so we can see both of those showing up, kind of just depending on the extent to which a person feels responsible and how they kind of explain their responsibility there. And so shame kind of, in a lot of ways, goes on a deeper level, cuts deeper, and the impact when we're looking at, trying to help a person with that in treatment, I know is a lot more immobilizing and a lot more difficult sometimes than guilt. Finally, it's important to think about this concept of bereavement overload that certainly can happen outside of a disaster, but it's very much more likely to happen when it's a loss due to a disaster. And that is kind of one loss after another in a relatively short period of time, which can really interfere with the ability to, grieve the first loss, because bam, here comes another, bam, here comes another, or maybe even they all come at once. And that definitely complicates the experience of grief and makes it a lot harder. All right, another type of loss is unexpected or sudden loss. So when a loss kind of comes out of nowhere. We'll see a whole lot more of like shock, denial, and disbelief. Of course, that happens in all kinds of loss, but these are some of the more pronounced features of this type of loss. We may see acute stress symptoms here where, and by acute stress, it's sort of what we think of as the precursor to PTSD. So if those symptoms are happening kind of immediately after a trauma, immediately after a loss, then this is acute stress. If those symptoms carry on for quite a while longer, then we start calling that post-traumatic stress disorder. But in terms of what they look like, they pretty much look the same. So we're talking about difficulty sleeping, eating, thinking clearly, sometimes long-term impacts on attachment. We may have, for example, somebody who, because of their experience of grief, now they're kind of more avoidant of, oh, pardon me, I was trying to turn off my notifications and instead I pinged my phone. I didn't realize I had my notifications still on my watch. Anyway, getting back to it, may become more avoidant of attachments or even more clinging to the people in their lives, more kind of anxiety about the potential loss of people that they love because now they've had this experience of loss. And then next is they may have nightmares or trauma-related triggers, depending on kind of the way in which the person died, that may play a role in some of the nightmares. It may not be directly related, but kind of follow a similar theme like helplessness and horror and that, danger and violence, that sort of thing. Next, we have, the experience of an emotional roller coaster, just really kind of drastic mood swings that can happen, swinging from sad to angry to, kind of being kind of out of control, just all over the place. Emotions can feel a lot bigger than they normally would be, especially in those initial days. And then sometimes we see something that's kind of like a numbness and intellectualized acceptance, like, okay, on this cognitive level, this level of my thoughts, I get it, and I'm reaching a place of I've accepted that this has happened, but the emotions haven't kicked in yet. So I'm not really feeling the loss emotionally. I haven't processed it. I just can't wrap my heart around it, even if I can wrap my mind around it, if that makes sense. All right, continuing on. So anticipatory grief, it's sort of the juxtaposition to that sudden loss, sudden unexpected loss kind of coming out of nowhere. Anticipatory grief is grieving that we do along the way, actually before a person is gone from our lives or before they have died. So an example of this would come with terminal illness. So we may experience a lot of anger about the situation, sometimes anger at ourselves, sometimes anger at medical providers, for example. Others who may play a role here, anger and blame, big one. Sometimes we begin to feel some detachment from the situation, even detachment from this person. And it's no reflection of how much we love them. It's really just one of the ways we cope with this loss how do you cope with the loss that you know is coming? Somebody that you care about is going to die. So sometimes we just emotionally kind of detach, and it's a way that we are trying to survive that situation. Sometimes personal growth is also something that comes from this. We reflect on those relationships, we reflect on what they mean to us, we reflect on our lives, and we can do some kind of personal growth through all of that. Also, our capacity for containing and coping with emotions sometimes grows as we deal with anticipatory grief. Of course, a fair amount of distress, suffering, pain, despair, as with any type of grieving. Sometimes there's a sense of relief that comes from it, especially for people who have been primary caregivers to a person who's passing on from a terminal illness. Even at times maybe wishing for that person's death as much as you love them. Maybe you want them to have release from pain. Maybe you want release from pain. It can be a real torment to watch somebody die in front of you that you care for. And so relief is a reaction that's common and complicated and often elicits a fair amount of guilt. It's not the only source of guilt that can come from anticipatory grief. Sometimes that guilt comes from, not being able to do anything, being limited in how much time you can spend with the person, guilt about maybe things you did or didn't do in the past. But certainly a fair amount of guilt comes from wishing for the release of death for this person. It's just such a difficult kind of combination of emotions that can come up. And if you're experiencing or have experienced any of those in anticipatory grief, I want you to know that's very normal, very, very normal. Next, I'll talk about this type of loss that we call ambiguous loss. So in cases of ambiguous loss, a loss has occurred, but there's something that's unclear or incomplete about it. So this can take a lot of forms, but the general idea here is that there are unanswered questions, maybe a lack of closure here. Often there's a lack of social acknowledgement or ritual that can come along with this. A lack of the normal means of coping that you may have had in other situations. Here are kind of two major types of ambiguous loss. So the first is the loved one that we're grieving here, or the situation, the life before that we're grieving, the loss that we've had is physically absent, but psychologically present. So this happens, for example, when a person is abducted and hasn't been found, when there's a homicide, a person leaves to go to the military, even when maybe somebody leaves to go to college, you're experiencing a loss where they're physically not present there, but emotionally they still kind of exist in your life and in your mind, and varying degrees of knowing kind of what's going on with them. Of course, when a person goes missing in action, definitely some ambiguous loss there, some unanswered questions. Losing someone due to terrorism, natural disaster, sometimes we don't know. Are they still out there? Are they okay? Are they not? And that's kind of one of the hallmarks here in terms of the distress that happens for us. When we're abandoned by somebody, emotionally, we still have that connection. Physically, they're not there anymore. Adoption and experience of immigration, whether you're the one who leaves or someone else leaves, a lot of ambiguous loss there, and a lot of not knowing. And then the other type, it's kind of the opposite. So this person physically is present, but psychologically they're absent. And so we see this when it comes to, for example, dementia, mental illness, traumatic brain injury, sometimes chronic illness, depression, addiction, workaholism, all these ways in which an attachment figure in our lives, somebody that we really love, they have fundamentally changed, and psychologically, who we once knew is no longer there, not in the same way, not in the same form. And yet, emotionally, and yet physically, they're still physically in front of you, but the emotional component just isn't what it once was. They're not present with you psychologically the way they once were. These are some types of ambiguous loss. And so some of the kind of hallmarks of this kind of loss, often the sufferers of ambiguous loss, the survivor, the person who has experienced this loss, the person left behind, or sometimes the person who leaves others behind, is denied rituals and acknowledgement of closure, is sometimes stigmatized. And so, if a person's still missing, they may not be able to have a funeral, a burial, those kind of things that mark our grieving and mark kind of our way of honoring this person's passage out of this life and getting our source of closure. Sometimes that's viewed really negatively, like you're giving up hope on this person, you're you don't really care. In cases, where there's a potential homicide, you might even be viewed with a suspicious eye, like, oh, maybe you're the murderer, because you don't care as much if you're getting that closure, if you're doing what you need to move on. Oftentimes denied emotional and social support by society. And this happens with grief in general, I want to mention, but ambiguous loss even more so. So there's this, and I think it's well-intended, we'll say, but oftentimes there's an emotional avoidance that comes along with talking about death and loss in general, because of the anxiety that it creates in us, and because we don't want to say the wrong thing and we don't know what to say. So often people kind of tiptoe around that and avoid. This happens much more frequently when it's something like an abduction, a homicide, a suicide, these things that are just absolutely horrific and have so much ambiguity and so much we don't know. And so people tend to avoid the survivors even more so then. So they're missing the emotional and social support that they most need oftentimes. People kind of walk on eggshells around it and don't want to talk about it. And they're expected to carry on as normal amid that uncertainty. So kind of expected to move on with life and act like it's just life as usual, while maybe still not knowing where their loved one is, or knowing where their loved one is, but not knowing what happened to them. Why are they gone? Who killed them? Why did they die by suicide? These kind of things that we just don't necessarily have the answers to. And so carrying on as normal is really hard. The trauma isn't over for people suffering ambiguous loss. They're still living in the trauma, right, currently, whereas when we suffer a loss that's not ambiguous, at least for the most part, we're able to do those rituals to get closure. We're able to answer those questions that help us make meaning of what has occurred. And it's by no means easy to move on, but it's not complicated by this additional layer of uncertainty. We may be struggling with dark emotions. So grief, doubt, guilt, anger, fear, anxiety, depression, helplessness, hopelessness, all of these things. And they can show up in other grief, but they can be exacerbated in ambiguous loss. I mentioned earlier acute stress symptoms that are trauma symptoms. Those symptoms can be kind of ongoing as you're literally living in the midst of the trauma of not having those answers. Sometimes we see that person being very preoccupied with that loved one, understandably so. I mean, how could you not be? But sometimes we see the opposite, and it's feeling emotionally avoidant of that loved one. And those things are judged all the time. I happen to be a big fan of true crime. And one of the things that I notice that I find really concerning from the perspective of a psychologist is that frequently law enforcement and the public in general will look at the reactions of people who have recently lost somebody, or somebody that they love is missing, as some kind of clue or indicator into their potential guilt or how they felt or didn't feel about that person. And that is just absolutely ill-informed and it's totally unfair, because people have a broad spectrum of reactions, and you may very well be completely innocent in the loss of this person. You had nothing to do with their disappearance or death. And you may love them with everything you have. And you may react to that by, yes, being preoccupied with them and very involved in the search, but you may also react in the opposite way and being very avoidant of talking about them and kind of just shut down. We all have different ways that we respond to our emotions, and avoidance is a very common one. And so you really can't tell guilt, and you really can't tell how much somebody loves someone based on what emotions show up. And I have to tell you, even in the case of not ambiguous loss, any kind of loss, it's not uncommon that I have people coming to therapy talking about grief and feeling like they're a terrible person if they weren't able to cry or if they didn't feel anything in that moment. And so if that's something that you have experienced or watched somebody else experience, just know that it fits well within the spectrum of what's a normal reaction to these situations, and especially if we're talking about an ambiguous loss and the trauma that's associated with that. Another thing that can happen is struggling with responsibility boundaries. And this is particularly referring to the instances of like mental illness, for example, like loved one gets schizophrenia, unable to care for themselves. Loved one gets dementia, unable to care for themselves. The person is psychologically absent, but physically present. They get a new disability, they get a chronic illness that requires care. And the caregiver may struggle with how much of this can I take on? How much of this, am I able to do to help them? And how much do I need to focus on my own life as well? How much should I take on? How guilty should I feel for the boundaries that I do have to set? Where do those boundaries even go? And those are not easy answers. So that's a common experience for people who are suffering ambiguous loss. And often, people can be really immobilized psychologically and sometimes literally due to the ambiguity of the situation, kind of in a state of being paralyzed or frozen, because what do you do in those times? So for more on ambiguous loss, all those things that I just shared came from a book on ambiguous loss. And I have linked the book here. So if you would like to check out the book, it's there. Just download my slides. And there's also a video, somebody from NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, I think is what that stands for, if I remember right, has summarized that book into presentations, if you prefer kind of a lecture form versus a book. As you can see, you can see the list from my last slide right here in this image. So you can just download these slides and click here and watch those YouTube videos that are embedded as well. Excuse me. All right, continuing on with the types of loss that we can have, there's something called disenfranchised grief. And what that means is grief that's treated as less than significant, grief that may be minimized by other people around you. And so often, this takes the form of a lack of recognition of specific kind of aspects of the situation. So it may be an unrecognized relationship. So maybe this is a lover, maybe it's somebody that had an affair with the person who has died or gone missing, a former spouse, a same-sex partner, close friends, people who might not be recognized as somebody who quote unquote should be experiencing grief or is entitled to have grief in this situation, but very much can experience grief. Next would be unrecognized type of loss. So that can come from miscarriage, abortion, stillbirth, adoption, pet loss. So all of these are experiences in which there may be others who judge the person for what happened to them, for the loss that they've experienced, think that they are not entitled to their feelings for whatever reason, think it's not a valid kind of loss. And I'm sure there are other examples that aren't listed here, but those are some examples of the types of loss that may be unrecognized, unvalidated, treated as less than significant. Next would be manner of death. So sometimes it's maybe it's a murder that is unsolved, not having anybody around who recognizes just like the impact of that type of a loss, especially, murder when it comes to like marginalized people, that tends to get less media attention. It tends to get less traction in terms of law enforcement, less people kind of marshal resources around to find missing or murdered people who are Indigenous, people who are Black, people who are trans, people who are homeless, people with addictions, for example. And so murder as a manner of death is one that can often go kind of unrecognized and unvalidated. Sex workers also, another group that they're going missing or murdered, can be kind of looked at as not a significant loss. Similarly, in suicide, the taboos that go around that can be something that leads to people to kind of distance themselves, invalidate, maybe even speak negatively about the deceased, calling them selfish, why would they do that? That was stupid. Some of the language that we have around that can be really hurtful to the people left behind. And also, particularly in the 80s, but can continue today, AIDS. So this is a manner of death that's been very stigmatized, associated with the LGBT community, which is stigmatized, viewed as, if you have this, you're a promiscuous person, other kind of fallacies and stereotypes that can be associated with AIDS that lead to the lack of recognition and validation of those losses. And then finally, an unrecognized griever. So a person who is viewed as they're not a person who knows anything about loss, or maybe their loss isn't as important as somebody else's loss. So the very young, often are kind of overlooked when we're talking about people who may be experiencing and living with grief. The very old, it's kind of neglected and thought, this person they know enough about it or it should be normal for them, or, these sorts of things, kind of ignoring their grief and the equal level of pain that it causes for those folks as it does for anyone. And finally, developmentally disabled folks who can also grieve the same as everybody else. There's also this thing called the compounding of loss. And so kind of like how earlier on I discussed how we can have like multiple losses kind of back to back that can make things harder. Similarly, there's compounding of loss that can come from one loss. So I want to shift away from only the talk about death a bit here, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, that's not the only kind of loss, and that's not the only forms of grief. We'll talk about a couple of others in which this compounding of loss may play a role. Not that compounding of loss doesn't play a role in the case of death too, but just kind of like trying to vary the examples a bit. So in the example of breast cancer, this is some potential compounding of loss that can happen when we're diagnosed with breast cancer or a loved one is. So having to have a mastectomy, for example, leads to the loss of a breast. For some people, that leads to losses in body image, even sexuality. That can lead to changes in the relationship with one's partner. Chemotherapy and radiation can lead to extreme illness, which can lead to changes in the major roles, activities, work, family life, hobbies. And so loss after loss after loss is sustained, all connected to that initial loss. It's like a earthquake that has an epicenter, but also all of these waves rippling out from there. Similarly, that this can happen with a breakup or a divorce, just like it can happen with the death of a partner. So when that happens to you, you may have a loss of income, you may have to relocate as you split up with this person or this person passes on. Loss of the activities that you shared. You may have shared family and friends that you no longer have access to. Maybe you lose your children or lose a lot of the time that you had with your children. Maybe you lose pets or you have to split time with those pets. You lose that role that you had in relation to that person and the ways in which they informed your identity. Loss of a lot of the things that used to bring joy and now trigger pain. Songs that you used to listen to together, or places that you visited together that used to be, a deeply important memory and something that brought a lot of joy can now bring a lot of suffering. All right, so next I just want to talk about some of the things that you can expect in a little bit more detail. You can expect to show up when you're grieving. This comic makes reference to one thing that is unfortunately most people who have grieved and suffered a major loss may have experienced at some point. And that's people who mean well, saying things that can be quite invalidating, such as everything happens for a reason, they're in a better place. Well, look on the bright side, at least blah, 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 going on and on and on. I can't tell you how many times I've had people discuss these kind of statements with them in therapy and how not helpful they are. So just know that your pain is valid. You don't have to look on the bright side. You don't have to think that it happened for a reason. You don't have to console yourself by thinking that they're in a better place. If that's not the emotional space that you're in, It's okay. You have a right to be angry. You have a right to feel what you feel. And you have a right to talk about that. And if you're getting invalidating responses, that's about that person trying to cope with what it brings up in them as they try to talk to you. It's not a reflection on how you should or shouldn't be grieving. So most people are familiar with the 5 stages of grief, which was put together by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. One thing I want to note about these is while this information can be really useful, and it definitely does show up a lot of the times with grief, this is not universal. Everybody doesn't experience grief the same way. It's also, I mean, there has been research done on it since it was developed, but it wasn't based in research. This was just kind of Kubler-Ross's sense of an attempt to kind of compile what she knew and experienced of grief. And so if your grief doesn't look like this, if it's not explained by this, if there's more going on or some of these stages you don't go through, it doesn't mean you're not grieving appropriately. And that's something that I definitely see show up sometimes in the therapy room. But those 5 stages include denial, anger, bargaining, like kind of wishing this away and hoping it will go away, depression, and acceptance. It was never intended to be a linear kind of journey where you start with denial, then you get angry, then you bargain, then you get depressed, then you accept it. It's never been intended to be interpreted that way, but it sometimes is. And so if you've heard it kind of put out there that way, it's not supposed to be that way. It isn't a stage-based model in the sense that stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's more like, here's an aspect of the experience you may have, here's a place you may be, and then later on you may be in another, and you can go back and forth between these different experiences of grief. And that's why I wanted to include this little image here, how we want grief to work, like I start here, I end here, I get over it kind of thing, straight line. That isn't how grief works. It's not how healing works in general, by the way, kind of regardless of what you might come to therapy for. It's just not how it is. It more often looks like this. And so we go kind of back and forth between these different experiences and different stages. And sometimes we feel better and sometimes we feel worse. And sometimes we backtrack back to anger, or sometimes we backtrack back to bargaining, and then we go back to depression. You know, we can go all over the map. Sometimes the fact that it is so full of ups and downs and backs and forths and doesn't follow a pattern can make us think maybe we're grieving the wrong way. And I just want to say, if you are grieving a loss, whether it's a death, loss of a relationship, a major life transition, whatever, any of those things I listed, it doesn't have to look the same for you as it does for other people around you, even if people tell you it should. The way that it shows up for you is the way it shows up, and that's okay. That's absolutely okay. And if you need some support to work through it, that's okay too. But don't judge yourself for what your process looks like, or how long it takes, or how long it doesn't take, or how emotion shows up, or how it doesn't show up, because it is one of those experiences in life that's very unique and very messy and really specific to you. Some of the things that might be included in your adjustment to loss in your grieving process, but might not be, is survival guilt. So this is not only guilt about maybe what you could have done or should have done, but also like, why wasn't it me? It should have been me. You know, this person deserved to live. I should have died instead. And maybe thinking of all the reasons why that should have happened to you. Or if you're seeing, you know, somebody you love deteriorate due to mental illness, physical illness, addiction, whatever, you know, guilt about the fact that you're not similarly impacted is another way survivor guilt can show up. Loss of functioning, just not being able to function the way you once did, do the things you used to do, keep it together as well as you used to. That's super, super common. Isolation, unfortunately, incredibly common. And I mentioned a little bit about the avoidance that people do around death. That's a big piece of it. And sometimes it has to do with our own kind of emotional state that we're in, that we just don't have the energy to reach out to other people anymore. And, And that can contribute to our feelings of isolation and make things worse for us too. We can go back and forth between feeling really numb sometimes. I often hear from people who are grieving that they feel guilty about that numbness or they think something's wrong with them. It's super not. Numbness is just such a normal part of this. And we may go from there to feeling horribly angry, horribly sad, back and forth, and that's very okay, and it's very normal. Oftentimes yearning for who or what we lost. And this one surprises people, but a lot of people going through major loss will have something that we psychologists call somatization, which is when the emotional experiences that we're having get expressed in our body. So you may have aches and pains, you may have mysterious illnesses that your doctors really can't pinpoint a cause for, even tingling, numbness, stomach troubles. I mean, it can take just about any form imaginable that, that are showing up in your body. This doesn't mean it's all in your head, okay? So literally, our bodies sometimes convert emotion into physical illness. It doesn't mean you're not physically ill. It just means that at least part of the cause may be psychological in origin. Sometimes with these really huge, like, disaster-related or trauma-related losses, we even see things like autoimmune disorders cropping up, either soon after or even in the years that follow. Some of the things that you might see, and this is kind of another perspective on the process of loss that can show up, is that you may begin in a state of avoidance that can include the kind of shock experience, the denial, not believing it, the confusion, the disorganization that happens kind of early on, and then eventually reaching a place of confrontation. And this is the highly emotional state where we might be on that emotional roller coaster. We're having the most intense reactions to grief and loss. They're felt most acutely. So this is pretty early on too. So if we're thinking about death, that avoidance, although you can kind of jump back and forth into it, like I said, messy process, but that might be more the first day, and confrontation might be in the first few weeks, or even some, first couple of months. And then reestablishment happens as slowly the grief begins to decline a bit, and we begin to start to feel more ready to enter back into the normal everyday world. Again, not linear. So we may do that whole process and begin to feel normal again, and then all of a sudden get hit again with a grief, trigger, in essence, that kind of brings us back. And that is why I wanted to include this video called The Ball and the Box. Really powerful analogy for grief, and I'm just going to go ahead and play it. This is from YouTube. Found out about this. And I'm actually just going to mute it and play it, because one of the things I found, I just remembered when I share these videos sometimes, is that sometimes the sound doesn't carry across Zoom. So basically what this person is saying is that we go through a loss, and then we notice like everything else around us is just kind of carrying on as normal. People are going to school, they're going to work, they're going shopping, life carries on for everybody else. That's kind of what this person is explaining as they're kind of drawing out these figures. But for us, we're trapped in this box that represents grief. And here in this box, there's a button. And this button is called pain. Okay. And initially, in the early stages of our grief, where our grief is like this giant ball in this box, and it's so big, it rests on that pain button. And basically pain is a constant component of our experience. It just doesn't go away, because all of that grief that we have is just so big. It's resting on that button. Over time, that grief may begin to shrink, but we still exist in that box of grief, and the button is still there. And so although that grief has shrunk, it's still, as it moves around and bounces around the box, it occasionally is still going to bump that pain button. And then here we go, all of those emotions kind of flood back into us all over again. And that's really how grief works. It doesn't work the way we kind of imagine or sometimes hope it will, where that little ball in that box just disappears. No, it just shrinks. And so as it bounces around that box, now it has more room to go where it won't always hit that pain button, but sometimes it is going to hit that pain button. And that's what real life is when it comes to grief. These are a couple of quotes that I think really kind of capture that experience. So some things in life, they can't be fixed. They can only be carried. And so we carry that loss with us forever after. And sometimes it's not about getting over it or for things to go away. It's about learning to live with it. The movie The Lovely Bones kind of talks about this, how we kind of rebuild our lives around that loss. Another thing that can happen for us is we may begin to grapple with spirituality in different ways, whatever that means for you. Oftentimes when we're grieving, and not just in the case of death, but in the case of major loss in general, we may begin kind of a new search for value and meaning in life, reevaluate what we value and what we believe and what we lean on. We may feel abandoned and angry, like, how could this happen to me or to the person I love? What did I do to deserve this? And maybe, if you're a believer in God, you may have anger at God for that, anger at the universe, anger at in any direction, really. Fear of the unknown, especially the unknown in our future, the unknown that might happen after death for us, that might have happened to this person we lost. Some people find a secular framework that helps them face the unknown, moving away from spiritual stuff in their life. And some people deepen their interest in faith or spiritual practice as a result. Any of that is normal. So what's the right way to grieve? In essence, there is no right or wrong way to grieve, but here's a little bit of info about things that can be helpful. Ritual matters. So if there are rituals that you can do and lean on, that helps. It's okay to do those. Being unable to carry out those rituals can make things harder for us, for sure. So if you have to find kind of an adjusted way to do those rituals, find another way of processing your grief. It's something that I really recommend. Rituals aside from death rituals can also be affected. Our traditions, holidays that are, let's say in the example of, a divorce or a breakup, the rituals that you had day to day with this person, what did you do together? All of that can be disrupted and we experience a sense of loss and we need ritual. This is just something that human beings really thrive with when we have ritual. And so reestablishing that is big. Whatever you can do to reestablish new rituals, new normals. There's a handout there that you can click that has some other kind of just information about what's typical and some reminders to keep in mind when coping with grief. So if you download the slides, you can click there and get those. Culture and peer influence play a really big role, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. So something I want to mention in the case of death, the funeral rituals and the mourning rituals, those things vary pretty drastically based on culture and peer and family influences. Something that I have seen show up in the therapy room time and time again. Let's say for, your white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, WASPs, sometimes I have folks come into my office who come from this cultural background and they feel like there's something wrong with them because they're not crying. And they don't want to talk about the person while people around them are encouraging them to, like, hey, you're not moving through your grief. You're just stuffing it down. Well, sometimes that may be the case. You may be just unhealthily stuffing it down. And sometimes that's the way that you cope and you might be different than other people and that's okay. One thing that I've seen coming up from Navajo clients in particular, and this can happen with other Indigenous clients and people from a variety of other cultures too, is there are taboos about speaking about the person and speaking about your loss afterward. It's kind of viewed as something that you can kind of drag out that grief, and it can be seen as something that's not healthy for you, that it's better to just do that in this constrained period of time. Let yourself have your crying for this constrained period of time that's observed. And then after that, you're supposed to move on and not cry. And so I have occasionally had a therapy client who's Navajo who's finding that it doesn't work for them that way. And they come in asking me, so what do I do? What is healthy? You know, in that case, it's not for me to tell you as a psychologist what's healthy for you. It's for you to explore and think about, okay, what am I observing happening in me? What am I being taught by my elders? What am I being taught by my culture? And how do I want to kind of resolve all of those? It's not for somebody outside of you to tell you. And by that, I don't mean disrespect to elders and people within your culture who may tell you how to grieve. What I mean is it's not for somebody like me to tell you, and it's not for just a random friend or somebody like that to tell you. It's a process that's personal between you and your culture and your family. Grief is often, probably most of the time, more painful and longer lasting than culturally acknowledged. So a lot of people experience, this is something I see happening with breakups a lot, but this happens with any kind of grief, really. More painful and longer lasting than people think it ought to be. So a lot of people kind of get messages of like, hey, you should be okay now, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly, and those don't help. So if you're giving somebody those messages, please don't. And if you're getting those messages from others, even if you don't want to do it externally by saying something to them internally, please push against those, because there's no timeline, there's no expiration date for you to feel what you feel about your loss. You need to find your own way through it. Other norms and societal expectations can really play a role. So what is the timeline that's normal for a person to grieve a 6-month relationship, or the loss of their dog? You know, for example, hey, there is no timeline, even if somebody tells you that there is, okay? There's no rule about what you can grieve over and what you can't grieve over. You get to grieve in your own way, to your own extent, over the things that you feel are important and the losses that you have suffered. I recently heard from a family friend who is widowed, that after she was widowed, another widow told her, now there's something that you need to know that other people don't tell you. There are widow rules. And if you violate the widow rules, then you're going to be looked down on. And so I think this is an important thing to mention if you have been widowed. There is an experience that some widows have of people judging how quickly or how slowly they move on to a new relationship, what they do with their partner's belongings, pictures in the house. And so I think it's really important for you to know that similarly to how I said, you can't look at whether emotion shows up or doesn't show up and judge that as okay or not okay, and a judgment of how much somebody loves somebody. You can't do that when somebody has just lost their life partner, because that looks very different for different people. Some people find it therapeutic to hold on to that person's belongings and not change anything in the house, and they don't want to move on for years. And some people just don't grieve that way. Some people will get out there and date sooner than other people find comfortable, and that's their choice. It's not anyone else's choice. And it also doesn't mean they didn't love the person, and it doesn't mean they're avoiding their grief. It's just another way that a person can cope that may be outside of what people expect. Some widows also find that it's too painful to see their partner's belongings, to see their clothes in the closet, to see their wedding picture up. You know, these kind of reminders can serve like triggers, and it's a trauma response for some people. So if you know somebody, or if you yourself are somebody who has a need to get those things out of sight and out of mind, that doesn't mean you don't care. It means that that's how you're coping with your grief. And so if you catch yourself judging a widow for violating either of these or any other widow rule that you might be making up, I just encourage you to keep in mind that grief is a personal process. That's their relationship for them to grieve in their way. And likewise, that would be true for you if you're the widow. All right. A couple of things. So acceptance is key. Acknowledge your feelings. What I mean by that is acknowledge the feelings that you have. When I say acceptance is key, it doesn't mean that I'm saying if you're not feeling anything, there's something wrong with you. Okay. Practice self-compassion. Try to get away from the shoulds for yourself and just let yourself be what you are and what it is. Connecting with others can be very, very therapeutic. So something that I would encourage you to do, if it fits within your culture and if it's consistent with your beliefs and values, and you're okay with doing so. So you're not bad if you don't do this, but something that can be helpful is storytelling. Storytelling and remembering the person, stories from their life, stories from your shared life, stories from, and this isn't just in the case of death, by the way, storytelling is also helpful when it comes to a breakup. Storytelling is also helpful when it comes to, maybe, for example, if you have become disabled, you're no longer able to do some of the activities you used to love, telling stories about when you used to, telling stories about when you lost the ability, telling stories about that breakup, telling stories about that death, about that trauma. All of those things can be really useful. If you have somebody in your life who's going through a major loss like that and it makes you uncomfortable when they talk about those things, whether it's grief or some other form of loss, please just sit with that discomfort and let them talk. Don't try to fix it for them. That's not what they need. Just validate and tell them what emotions you see showing up for them. Tell them how they're dealing with it is normal and it's okay and you approve of it and you're here with them. Don't avoid it. And don't be shy about checking in. Just say, how are you doing? You want to go get, some hot chocolate with me? You want to go to lunch? Just open the door, but don't try to control what it looks like and don't try to encourage. Even though you may mean well, it doesn't help. If you do have your own experiences with grief, it may be a good idea to share those with that person. But even that, I would say, maybe check in with them before sharing it and say, would you like to know about what it was like for me? I wanted to share this article that a man wrote about what his experience was when his wife of 51 years died. And one of the big things he talks about is the avoidance that people did around him. Just something that you may find useful and validating in your own experience. Kind of going back to that idea of disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss, one area where I see this showing up a lot, and it might be in part because I see college students for therapy, and most of them are, in their early to mid 20s probably, and early 30s maybe, I guess. Early 20s to early 30s, we'll say, is the vast majority of them. There's this interesting way that disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss shows up in their dating and breakups. And a piece of this, I think, is attached to hookup culture. If you're not familiar, hookup culture is kind of a current dating trend that's going on for young adults in particular, although it can span, really can span any age, but it's pretty predominant in younger adults. And that's a culture in which casual sex is very much kind of the norm, and emotional attachments can actually be kind of stigmatized. And so it can kind of be viewed as it's not cool to get attached. Sometimes the younger folks will refer to this as like catching feelings, for example. What I see showing up in the therapy room is that there's a lot of shame people can feel about the fact that they are struggling with a breakup or struggling with somebody who they were hooking up with, who they didn't get into an official relationship with, but this person, they were having a sexual relationship, and then this person either kind of cuts it off or is sleeping with somebody else, and the pain that comes with that. There's kind of this sense of like, you're supposed to be okay with that, and a lot of people are not okay with that. And what I hear a lot from the students that I see for therapy is not only a lot of self-blame for the emotions that are associated, like I shouldn't care, it's stupid that I care, what kind of a loser am I, I'm too clingy, I'm too needy, but also that they hear that from their friends, that it's ridiculous they haven't moved on yet, that their friends are tired of hearing about the breakup. And I just want to say how toxic that is. Going back to what I said before about storytelling, storytelling is important for when you have a loss, and when a person feels what they feel, that's just what they feel. So it's not something that should be shamed. And if you're a person who tells your friends you don't want to hear about it, I would encourage you to expand your capacity to provide empathy and support and listening, and stop judging your friends for that. If you're the person being judged, I would encourage you to either tell your friends they need to do that, or find better friends. Push back against that idea that just because there's a hookup culture there, I'm not allowed to catch feelings, and it's weird or wrong that I do. I also wanted to share this study. Now, the title of it is "A Lot of Women Don't Enjoy Hookup Culture, so why do we force ourselves to participate?" It's a pretty interesting analysis of what's going on, and this quote on this slide comes from that. But actually, the study found that a lot of men feel the same. I know that's not inclusive of genders, that don't fit on the binary. That's just how the study framed it, not how I'm intending to talk about it. But I would encourage you to check it out, because it's really interesting. It turns out it's not just women who don't necessarily feel all that comfortable with hookup culture, but oftentimes men are socialized in such a way as to think that it's not manly, it's not cool, and I'm supposed to see it as a conquest. I'm supposed to brag about sleeping with a lot of different women. And so these are some of the things that can really make the grief and the loss for anybody of any gender to struggle more with that, and have a harder time moving on, ironically, the more pressure that there is to move on. So just a little note about ambiguous loss there. Excuse me. A couple of other tips for coping with ambiguous loss. So accepting the reality of the loss, especially in situations where there could be some denial. One thing I see in dating is, maybe reading signs that person might still come around, like hanging around waiting for them. It's okay to do. Like, I'm not judging. You can do that. I will say that the longer that you stay in that kind of holding pattern and holding your breath, the longer you suffer. And sometimes we do that instead of, because there is a possibility of reunification for this relationship. Sometimes we do it because we want to avoid the pain of the loss. And so, introspect and see where you're at. Don't judge where you're at in that process, but it might be something to consider. And one thing that can help you move forward is telling that story. Something that people don't understand is that sometimes you have to tell that story again and again, because the story starts to change and morph as you're telling it. You start to attend to different things, and you start to see more themes of acceptance arising as we tell this story, more themes of coming to terms with the loss, whether it's a death or a breakup or some other kind of loss. More themes that direction, and less the direction of pushing against it and not wanting it to be there. And for some people, that's very helpful to do that talking aloud and sharing the experience and figuring out, what is it that they're going through. Acknowledging the pain that shows up. Some things that can be really helpful is to validate that pain, and also incorporate a regular mindfulness practice that can help you be more aware of what's going on, especially if you kind of sometimes have a hard time knowing what you feel or tuning into that. Adjusting to the new normal. So doing good self-care, rest, recreation, accepting help from others, finding reasons to laugh. Don't feel guilty the first time you laugh after you've lost somebody. It doesn't mean that it didn't matter. It means that you're learning how to carry that with you forward into this next life, and that your life doesn't have to stay locked in the past and locked in the loss. You can carry the loss along with you. Beginning to invest in the other relationships in your life, in other activities, in your future, taking refuge in the community around you, making meaning, celebrating what is, not just grieving what was. And something that can help is, there are a lot of things with ambiguous loss that are outside of your control. You may not be able to control what happened to this person, where they are, whether or not you ever get those answers to tell you, why they're no longer in your life, why they've died, why they left you, why things are the way they are. There may be a tendency that you can have to obsess about the things that you can't control, like what's going on inside of them or was going on inside of them that might have led to this loss. It's tempting to do that, but all of that just keeps you kind of tormented and trapped. And so give yourself some time to do it and then step away from it and try to focus on the things that you can control and the things that matter, and put your energy there when you're in this place of being ready to invest in the future and move forward. That is the end. I know this was a little bit longer workshop, so if you're still hanging in there with me, I really appreciate it. If you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and also if you have ideas for future workshops. As you can see, we're getting close to the end of the semester, and I haven't yet set my agenda for spring semester. So if there are things you'd really like me to talk about that I haven't this semester, or things you'd like me to talk about more, aspects of any of these you'd like me to talk about more, questions you'd like me to answer, don't be shy. Feel free to reach out, and I'll look at, potentially including that in a live stream for next semester, or sending you an email response, depending on what feels appropriate. All right, that's it for today. Next week, I'll be talking about a toolkit for stopping impulsive behaviors. After that, we'll take a break for Thanksgiving. And coming back on the 3rd, we will talk about relationships that make you feel like you're crazy. Why do you feel crazy in this relationship? What might be going on? And what are the signs that this could potentially be an abusive relationship? And this refers to all kinds of relationships, whether it's romantic, a work relationships, a family relationship, anything. And then finally, the last one, or nope, there's 2 more, sorry. The next one, December 10th, is going to be relationship effectiveness, balancing me with you, my needs, my self-respect, your needs, your self-respect, and keeping our relationship positive and effective. And then the last one, the power of positivity, looking at what positive psychology can tell us about what happy people tend to do more frequently than people who are less happy, and what that can teach us about how to increase our own happiness in life. Thank you for tuning in, and hope to see you all again for future live streams. Take care.